Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT Podcast with your hosts, Michael Maleka
and Molly Kilty. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of our Jack Westin MCAT Podcast with your hosts, Mike and Molly. Mike, happy belated winter holidays to you. How are you doing?
You as well, Molly. I've had so much great rest, relaxing over the season, still helping some students out, but I'm excited that we have this time to rest, but also, balance out our MCAT prep now, And so that's something we're probably all feeling, both getting the rest, but also talking MCAT stuff. And that's why you and me, we have our break, but we're not stopping talking about, the MCAT. We had our kind of episode last week where we kind of given the encouragement, but now we can kind of get back onto kind of the topic that we were discussing, kind of building off of last episode.
Yes. Yeah, and I feel like this episode is being released right around the time of New Year's. And a lot of us are probably thinking New Year's resolution, I want to knock this MCAT out of the park. I want to do really well. I want to lock in. I want to study really hard. And it all comes down to studying with intention.
I was like, that was not prepared, but I knew exactly where you're going with it.
Yeah, right. It's being intentional about what you want to study and how you want to study it. Okay. So ultimately, we've been on a little kick here with meiosis and gametogenesis and all of these fun things, right? We talked about oogenesis and spermatogenesis. In this episode, we're going to keep that going with the menstrual cycle, which is always fun to talk about. And I say that seriously, although I know most of you are probably rolling your eyes. Most students and biological females do not enjoy the menstrual cycle, although it is fascinating. And it's an area that, and it's, is it the number one highest yield thing on the MCAT? No, but it's a pretty interesting and testable topic. Right. It's valuable to know on multiple levels. So when we get into our discussion here today with menstrual cycle, this is a chance for you to show up for yourself in what you have maybe set as a New Year's resolution, which is, I'm not just going to memorize this stuff. I'm going to focus on understanding it and trying to visualize, how is this going to show up? How can I be ready for when I see a passage or a question about this? Not just, can I anticipate the back of my Anki card.
Right. And I think this is just one of those topics. I think similarly to how we taught, the glycolysis and the metabolic pathways, or how we went through muscle contraction, this is kind of a story, like of a pathway where it's like this thing leads to this thing, right? A lot of times, this cycle can be a little bit intimidating to study because there's a lot of like, oh, what I have to memorize during this phase, this is high, and during this phase, this is low. But rather, if you actually understand this cycle, actually makes a lot of sense why certain hormones are high at certain points. And so that's how we're going to be covering it today, so that you understand the why. I don't think there's going to be any point in this episode where you're like, oh, you just have to memorize this. There is a very good reason why things are higher or lower at certain points. And that's kind of the lens that we're going to be kind of looking at it today. And so we kind of preface, we're going to be talking about, the menstrual cycle. But when talking about like the menstrual cycle, it's actually two parallel cycles. I have to say that if you're not watching, Molly's like big grin just laying it out, because this is something that's always like kind of misunderstood about the menstrual cycle. It's like, oh, it's the menstrual cycle. It's like not really just one. We have to kind of look at it as two separate cycles: the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. And so for context, ovarian cycle is kind of looking at what's happening in the ovaries, and the uterine cycle, is kind of what's happening in the uterus, because they're kind of both happening at the same time. But what we're going to do is we're going to kind of focus on one at a time and kind of relate the two, because they work so tightly together, but they are two separate things.
Yeah, I love that we call it the menstrual cycle, because normally when we talk about that, right, it's having a period. And most people, whether you're pre-meds or a biological female or just a human being in general, you think menstrual cycle means periods. And it's kind of funny that we completely eliminate the ovarian cycle, because really, for the most part, the uterine or the menstrual cycle follows the shots called by the ovarian cycle.
Right.
All the hormonal timing of all of this, for the most part, is either done by the hypothalamus, like the HPG axis, hypothalamus, pituitary, gonads, right, which is the ovaries. We give a lot of attention to the menstruation part, and yet that's really not the shot caller of the situation.
Right.
So
it's kind of like the byproduct. Right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. They're both very important, and I'm excited to get into both pathways and how they interlock, and how they, respond to each other, how they both contribute to the essential like process of preparing the body for pregnancy, right? Because that's
Mm.
the goal, right? If you are of reproductive age and I almost said years of evolution, with millennia of evolution, right? That is the monthly process and procedure is let's prepare the body for pregnancy. If fertilization happens, great, your body is fully prepared to support and, you know, basically provide a home for a growing embryo and then fetus. If no fertilization, all right, let's reset starting in next month. Okay, so
Mhm.
these are
Mhm.
monthly hormonal cycles. We will be using a couple terms from our endocrine lecture
Mm.
or lesson or podcast or whatever you want to call it. If you haven't listened to that, that's a great episode first, because this is essentially an application of that hormone and endocrine info. And we're actually going to take it to a pretty fun, specific spot, especially when we talk about feedback loops in this
Mhm.
episode. So if you're totally new, you've never heard anything about hormones at all, might be good to check that one out first.
Yeah, yeah. We're talking about a lot. That when we're gonna get into like feedback loops and some really cool, really cool feedback loops. Probably one of the coolest ones on the MCAT. But yeah, if you don't have a good understanding of like what a feedback loop is, we do go into much more on that on the endocrine episode. But if you're like Mike, Molly, I'm great with the endocrine hormones. I'm great. I'm ready. Well, let's get started. And I think yeah, I'm just so excited. I think the first place, a good place to start is the shot collar. Like I think we're gonna start with the ovarian cycle and then we'll go on to the uterine cycle. But I think once you understand the ovarian cycle, the uterine cycle is actually like pretty kind of easy to coincide. Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah.
Right. And so when talking about the ovarian cycle, we have to kind of think about it in three separate phases, right? With the ovarian cycle, there's the follicular phase, ovulation, and the luteal phase. So let's start with the kind of first phase, which is the follicular phase. So I want you to, I think a lot of the times we memorize names rather than kind of understanding, okay, wait, what did I just say? The follicular phase. So that means the kind of the star of the show is the follicle, kind of that follicle in the ovary. So let's start what happens in the follicular phase. So first, it's kind of the first 2 weeks of, because we said the menstrual cycle is about 28 days or a month. The first 2 weeks from day 1 to day 14 is the follicular phase. So here it kind of begins on like day 1 is menstruation, right? You've kind of shed that kind of uterine lining there, progesterone tanked, and now we're kind of starting again. And so during at the beginning of follicular phase, our hypothalamus, right, if you're again, and this is the endocrine callback, is releasing a lot of what we're called gonadotropin releasing hormone, right? Whenever you think of releasing hormone, think hypothalamus, right? And that's targeting the anterior pituitary to produce and release two specific hormones: follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So these hormones are very important when we're talking about the menstrual cycle, two for very different reasons. And one of them we'll talk about as a really big kind of part of the show later on. And so, but these are releasing both FSH and LH. And really the star of the show at this point is the FSH, the follicle stimulating hormone. Because remember, we're in the follicular phase. Who's the star of the show? The
The
follicle.
follicle.
So, right. So the follicle stimulating hormone is going to go from the anterior pituitary, which is like in the brain, all the way. It's going to circulate through the blood because this is an endocrine hormone, to the ovaries, and it's going to target the follicle. Now, the follicle is this kind of little compartment that has kind of the growing egg or what the oocyte that's currently there. We talked about the stages of gametogenesis like
Mhm.
2 episodes ago, I guess now. So if you're like, oh my goodness, wait a minute, oh, which phase is our gamete or is our egg in? Go check that out. But we have the kind of the growing oocyte in that follicle, and the follicle stimulating hormone is going to target the follicle and stimulate it, and it's going to mature, right? And so during the follicular phase, the follicle is going to mature to a point and going to be releasing estrogen, right? That's what's kind of targeting. The FSH is targeting the follicle to release estrogen, but while it's releasing estrogen, the follicle is maturing kind of to a point. Now, this is one thing that's kind of super important because you're going to be thinking, oh, if it's releasing estrogen, normally estrogen is under negative feedback. So what it's going to do is going to tell the anterior pituitary, hey, stop producing FSH, right? I don't need any more of me, right? So that is normally what's going to happen. So once the estrogen is produced, it's going to tell the anterior pituitary, stop producing more FSH. And so the amount of FSH is going to go down. And you would think, oh, less FSH means estrogen will also go down, right? Wrong. So, and that's what I actually, this is kind of a point that I kind of used to, like, I was actually really confused because if you actually look at a diagram of what goes on with estrogen, even though FSH goes down, estrogen keeps on rising. And I was like, wait a minute, why is this going on? Well, it's because our follicle has matured. It's matured to a point, so now because it's matured, it actually doesn't need input from the follicle stimulating any hormone anymore to produce estrogen. Once it's matured to a point, it's just going to produce estrogen on its own. It does not need FSH. It's like, oh, I got that initial signal to mature. Now I'm mature. I don't need you anymore, FSH. I'm just going to keep on producing estrogen. And so this is what we see as the follicular phase progresses. FSH will go down along with luteinizing hormone, which hasn't had a huge part to play yet, right? But then estrogen's going to keep on rising. I really like to stress that point because that was something that genuinely confused me for way too long when I was studying this. Yeah.
Yes. And that's really the first weird hormonal feedback thing, right? It makes
Right.
sense that estrogen would shut off FSH, right? And LH really in the pituitary makes sense, right? It's preventing the additional stimulus or it's preventing the additional production of estrogen, but it doesn't, as you said, right? The other weird thing that comes in with hormonal feedback loops is actually in the next phase, right? So that was the follicular phase. Everything has to do with the follicle stimulating hormone. The follicle really is the star of the show. In our second phase, which this is really, as far as how it is commonly discussed on MCAT, this happens in a day, right? It is an individual event. It's not a phase that takes place over 2 weeks, right? Ovulation is something that happens once. It's an event. It's not a phase where it takes place over a period of time. And during ovulation, we actually see another major shift from what we normally expect with feedback loops. Okay, because as we know, as estrogen rises, FSH and LH will be inhibited, right? Normal, that's negative feedback. And that is true up until a point. What's fascinating is as the follicle has matured and continues to produce estrogen, even though it now no longer has FSH telling it to produce estrogen, it's going to reach a critical concentration above which it actually switches from negative feedback loop, where the end product inhibits the essentially the synthesis of more of that end product, to a positive feedback loop. Now, past a certain point, if you have a ton of estrogen, it actually makes it more favorable to create our FSH and our LH, especially our LH. That really is going to be the focus for ovulation, right? LH is luteinizing hormone. It's another anterior pituitary hormone. And this surge of LH that happens once you have a very high concentration of estrogen, that surge is actually what creates ovulation, right? In which you have the release of that oocyte or that developing oocyte into, and this is common misconception as well, not directly into the fallopian tube from the ovary, but actually technically into the abdominal cavity. The fallopian tube's got these little fingers that ultimately bring in the oocyte. And this is a good callback to our previous episode, right? We know that during the ovarian cycle, typically one oocyte is going to complete meiosis one each cycle and become a secondary oocyte, right? If you are done with meiosis one, you're going to be a secondary oocyte because you're named for what process you're about to experience. So secondary oocyte will remain in metaphase two. It will not complete meiosis two. It will remain in metaphase two until it's fertilized. Okay, which is a fascinating process. It's still not officially a gamete, really. It is haploid. We talked a lot about that in our last content episode, but it is going to be arrested in metaphase two until it is fertilized, if it's fertilized, right? So it's released into that abdominal cavity. It's brought into the fallopian tube, which is where, if we have a potential fertilization event, it will meet the sperm nucleus. So, what I want to make sure that we highlight here is during ovulation, again, this is not a long drawn out process. This is happening in the course of hours or like a day. Okay. Again, as far as it's normally taught, that increase in estrogen past that critical concentration is what I like to say. We switch from negative feedback, which reduces FSH and LH, to positive feedback, which creates a surge in LH, like a huge spike, which is what triggers the basically rupturing of that follicle and the release of the ovum or the oocyte into the abdominal cavity where it's brought into the fallopian tube.
Yeah, I know the MCAT loves like if there's any point in the menstrual cycle, at least the ovarian cycle that the MCAT likes to test, they do love asking questions about ovulation. I think that's where most of the questions are. You will get
Yeah.
questions about follicular phase as well as the next phase we're going to talk about, but they love asking things like what triggers ovulation or what's released in ovulation. Those
Yeah.
are a lot of the times the questions that they're going to ask. And I
Yeah.
think now is also a good time to talk about our next phase, kind of what's going on. Because now we've, our follicle, we matured it, we've ruptured it. Well, now does like the follicle just like disappear? No, right? It's kind of the start. It's now the start of the show and kind of this next phase, which is the luteal phase. Now, again, focusing on the name, who the star of the show is, right? Luteal phase, the corpus luteum, right? Which is what the ruptured follicle becomes. Because the follicle had that developing oocyte, released that secondary oocyte, but now that ruptured follicle turns into this kind of, it's like, I think the line for it is like yellow body, like luteum is yellow, corpus body. So it's like this yellow body. And all you need to know about the corpus luteum is it's a factory for progesterone. This is now the main hormone. Because before, if you looked at like a hormone chart, there's zero progesterone, follicular phase. There's like zero progesterone in ovulation. But if you see luteal phase, progesterone now spikes up because now you have the corpus luteum producing a whole bunch of progesterone. And now progesterone is going to be like knowing that progesterone now comes is going to be really important when we talk about the uterine cycle. But now the progesterone is going to be really, really high during this luteal phase. Um, again, without kind of diving too much into the uterine cycle now, because we'll get to it, like I just want you to think like when it comes to the role of progesterone, it's all about maintenance of the lining, which we're going to talk about. But estrogen's involved in building the lining, progesterone involved in keeping that lining there. But all that because we're gonna again, I don't want to focus too much on uterine. We're gonna get there, but it's
We'll
just
get
so
there.
involved. But all I want you to know is like during this is like the last kind of 2 weeks ish from day 14 to day 28 and this is on averages. I know
Yeah.
it can vary widely, but on average day 14 to day 28, progesterone is going to stay high. But the corpus luteum is not this kind of it's not going to stay forever, right? The
Yeah.
corpus luteum is kind of on a kind of ticking clock, or over time it's going to start degrading, right? As long as fertilization doesn't occur. But assuming, fertilization and implantation does not occur, the corpus luteum is going to eventually degrade and die. And without the corpus luteum producing progesterone, progesterone is eventually going to crash. And it crashes at the very end of the luteal phase. And that crashing of that progesterone is actually what ends the kind of this phase of the luteal phase, causes menses, and then you begin the cycle all over again from day one, the follicular phase. And that's kind of like I don't think I've missed anything there. I think that's kind of like the entirety of the ovarian cycle.
Yeah, I feel like I don't know if we officially mentioned it, but it would be good to mention. We're saying days, and you're right, very different.
Mhm.
Not, the experience that individuals have that menstruate, it's very different in terms of the
Mhm.
timing, the length. But just so you know, when we talk about the days, right,
Mhm.
day 1 to 14, day 14 being ovulation on average, and then 14 to 28, day 1 is the first day of menstruation.
Mhm.
So just so you know, some people think, oh, it's like the first day that your period or menstruation is over, that's day 1. It's actually the
Mhm.
first day of your
Mhm.
I keep saying menstrual cycle because that's what is colloquially
Right?
used to describe
Yeah,
it. The
yeah.
first day of menses is your first day of your menstrual cycle and your ovarian
Ovarian
cycle.
cycle.
Um,
Mhm.
and just a couple other really interesting things. If anyone has ever tried to conceive before, if anyone has ever tried to analyze ovulation, anything like that, a lot of the procedures and tests and things like that that are used to track things like ovulation have to do with LH. So like there are a lot of real world applications for this, which I think are really fascinating. Like ovulation predictor kits are very common, especially with people that are trying to conceive naturally. And those predictor kits are actually detecting LH, luteinizing hormone,
Mm.
because we know the surge of LH is what ultimately triggers ovulation. So if your LH levels are going up, you can tell that ovulation is coming about very soon, right? And again, if you're trying to conceive, that information is important to have. Even fertility treatments, right? Like let's say you are struggling to conceive, certain fertility treatments actually stimulate the same receptors as LH to try and see if we can trigger, let's say, ovulation, right? We're giving analogs for LH to see if we can help that process, help the body prepare itself for fertilization and all of those other things that can be desired by a couple or individual. Um, and even if you are extremely, let's say, extremely stressed, if anyone has ever experienced, any menstruating individuals ever experienced extreme stress, right? Sometimes you can either, and I've heard many things from individuals I've spoken with, either have period come early, have period come late. Sometimes you skip ovulation. Like extreme stress knocks off your normal reproductive hormones. It changes the timing of your cycles, and sometimes we experience, pretty significant changes and differences. So, to anyone out there that experiences ovarian cycles and menstrual cycles, if you've ever been like, this is weird, this isn't textbook, it's like oftentimes, it's a very sensitive cycle. It's very important, but there are so many factors that can influence it that I think are fascinating to learn about as someone who experiences those things, all the different factors that can influence it. You're maybe not going to get a ton of questions about it on MCAT, but I think again, when you study for the MCAT, there are so many interesting prompts of things that you can learn more about that are going to be clinically relevant, but also interesting as a human being. So those are just a couple of the ways that you may see this science play out in your everyday life, because it's really all around you. And I think following that thread of curiosity whenever you can is what makes MCAT prep more fun.
Right. Like when you can apply it, like the better you can apply it to like your interest. Like, oh, this is something that I experience. Right. Like,
Yeah.
and this is something I can experience. Like, I want to know more. Like, and that's always something that I think is cool. Like, and I think we talked about a lot, yeah, especially in psychology and sociology, because those are things that like, everyone has experienced these things in their day-to-day life. The more that you learn about, the more that you learn about yourself, you're like, oh, like that's what's going on right now. That's really interesting. That's really cool. And so again, the more that you can enjoy this process, the better your studying is. Like again, this is why a lot of people like sometimes can feel burnout from studying these sciences because they're like, oh, I have to learn about these. Like, no, you get to learn about it. This is super cool. So I love that energy. Again, Molly's energy about this, like it's so interesting. I love it. I love it. I love it.
It's
Um,
also what keeps us coming back, right?
right?
Like I think it could be like, oh, there's so many things to learn, but it's also what makes it so cool. And
Makes
what
it
has
so
made Mike and I stay hang out in the MCAT space for way too long.
way too long than we should. No, because again, when there's some actually it's so funny. Like the other day, I was like with I was meeting. I'm like in New York now, meeting my brother's friends. Like I haven't seen him in a long time, and I was like at a conversation. We were at McDonald's, and we were just talking about like biology, and like we were talking. I was like, I remember talking about hypokalemia and like how it's related to like aldosterone, and how it's related to like hormonal shifts in like the kidneys. And I was like. Again, my brother was like, "Shut up, Michael." Like that.
Yeah, I was about to say,
That's my brother
never
was, but there
started.
was, he's like in the tech space. But there was somebody who was like there who was like in like who was interested in taking the MCAT, and they were like
Oh,
studying these things, and they were like, "Oh, like that was interesting." I was like, "Oh, let me tell you all about it." And then he like talked to me after. He was like, "You talk way too much about it," and I'm like, "I'm sorry. I know it's just something I'm so interested in."
yeah.
But yeah, but enough about our wild and maybe obsessive interest about a lot of this stuff. Coming
Passion.
back
I
to
call it passion.
passion. We love passion.
Yeah.
Coming back to the menstrual cycle, because we've kind of covered mostly we've covered the ovarian cycle.
Yeah.
And as kind of my last kind of talk about progesterone kind of indicates, what we're going to kind of talk about now is the uterine cycle and how a lot of what's going on in the ovarian cycle will reflect what's going on in the uterine cycle. Like it makes a lot of sense, especially, and I think really especially during the luteal phase. But let's kind of start with the uterine cycle. And I know you're actually really, really good at talking about this. So I'll let you take this away, Molly. I the passion that Molly has for this, so I'm like, is infectious. So I'll let you start it off, Molly. What's going on in the uterine cycle, right? Let's start at day one, right? Like day one, right? What's going on?
So I think this is really interesting because again, many individuals feel like, oh, your period or menses or the actual, the period where you may see blood or discharge, etc. Many people feel like that's the end. And in some ways, it corresponds to the end of the previous cycle, but ultimately this happens on day one. Okay. And
Mhm.
it's kind of funny because in the menstrual or uterine cycle, we do kind of start at the end, right? What we see in day one, especially day one to like five, this changes a lot. Okay. The duration of menses for different individuals. Some have a heavy flow for 3 days, some have a light flow for seven. There's so much diversity here. But ultimately, let's say on average, day one to five, you experience menstruation. Okay. And this is the shedding of the endometrial lining. Okay. And we haven't talked about the endometrium yet, because again, we kind of start at the end. The key thing here is we are going to be building, it's kind of cute. We're basically building a home to help implant an embryo, right, which will create a fetus. The body, the female body is trying to almost create a little nest. Okay, like I need to make sure I have plenty. I need to make sure that this is highly vascularized so I can get proper blood flow so that I can get a lot of nutrients and gases and all these things for this developing embryo. Every single month for many of us, we build this little nest. Okay. And at the beginning of the menstrual or uterine cycle, we basically have heard the body is hearing, oh, we didn't have fertilization. We didn't have implantation. Okay, well, fine. I'm getting rid of it. I'm tearing it
I
all
worked
down.
so
This
hard.
nest is stupid. I can't believe I tried. Right? We're shedding the endometrial lining that we just spent the entire month assembling, like, oh, I hope that this carries a baby. And if it doesn't, it's like
It's
rage
like, well,
quitting. It's
I'm getting rid of this all.
cramping. It's so angry. And specifically, it hears this, and I'm putting air quotes, of course, no ears here. It responds and realizes, hey, this did not happen. I don't have a fetus to support right now because we have a very low level of estrogen and progesterone, right? This hormonal input is telling the endometrial lining and the uterus, I did not have fertilization and implantation happen, in which case, tear it all down, I'll start again. Right? The clock is ticking. One more month, I'll do it again. All right. Tear it all down. That's menses. And then we're going to build it back up. Okay. So overall in the uterine cycle, we're going to see the actual menses, day one to five. And then we're going to start to build up the next endometrial lining, right? We're going to have a proliferative phase where we're trying to build the basics. And then we're going to have more of like the maturation. We call it the secretory phase, where we're really going to grow and get ready for it, right? It's kind of funny to think about it that way, but that really is what it is, right?
Right,
That's how the body is reacting.
right.
So we're getting the hormonal feedback from the ovarian cycle and we're responding to it intentionally, right? In the menstrual phase, we're tearing down the nest, right? We're shedding it through the vaginal canal, right? Getting rid of it so that we can build it again, right?
Right.
And that would be the proliferative phase, which starts right after day five,
Right
moving
after day
into
5.
about the time of ovulation.
Right. And so this is kind of all happening. And I'm always, when I'm learning about the uterine cycle, I'm always thinking like, wait, what's going on in the ovary at this point? Right. Because
Mhm.
like if you kind of correspond it, like, yeah, the menstrual phase, right, is kind of the day 1 to 5. And then the proliferative phase is like, again, these are very rough
Very
averages,
general.
very rough averages. 5 to 14, that's all happened during the follicular phase. Like this is all still follicular phase if we're kind of thinking back to the ovarian cycle. And I'm always thinking like, okay, what's happening hormone wise? During the menstrual phase, like progesterone and estrogen, extremely low, right? Again, progesterone, like our corpus luteum, It's degenerated. There's nothing producing progesterone.
Yeah.
And remember, during the beginning phases of the follicular phase, there wasn't much estrogen. There wasn't. But now, think what's happening during this like proliferative phase, like during like day 5 to day 14. This is where, oh, the next follicle, again, the last follicle turned to corpus luteum, it's gone. The next follicle, it's mature now. So it's producing a lot of estrogen. And it's that estrogen that's causing the proliferation. It's the estrogen that's actually beginning to rebuild that endometrial lining, right? And so I always kind of think about when it comes to hormones in the uterine cycle, I'm always thinking like the estrogen is kind of is what actually begins to build the lining. Right. And that's just up until like the day 14. There's no progesterone there. But again, right now we're just building the lining because there's a lot, like as we saw, there's that growing estrogen there. And then, right, now we can, that's like the proliferative phase. But then we now kind of ovulation occurs. And once ovulation occurs, now we have the secretory phase, right? And the big thing, like we mentioned with kind of the last, like the ovarian cycle, is during the secretory phase, right? We are really, really thickening that lining, but also making sure it's maintained. Right. And that's the role of progesterone. Right. Again, I don't want I when we were having this conversation before, I'm Molly, I'm very much of the mind, okay, progesterone maintains lining, it keeps them from being shed, but it doesn't only have that process. It's also very involved in continuing to build and thickening the lining, continuing that vascularization to make sure that if an embryo does end up embedding, it has all the nutrients, all the vascularization it needs. But it's during this phase that we're really getting that thickening because of the effects of both estrogen and progesterone. But for an MCAT sense, if you're thinking, okay, how are they going to test me on the MCAT? MCAT is very estrogen is what builds, progesterone maintains.
Yes,
Mhm.
absolutely. And I feel like it's important to recognize whenever students want to memorize and where that can lead
Mhm.
them astray, right? I
Mhm.
think a lot of students, when I first teach this material, are like, oh, I thought progesterone was the proliferative phase because they both start with P.
Mhm.
Nope. Again, think about the timing. Okay, the
Mhm.
proliferative phase happens first, the secretory phase happens second. They roughly, like if you think of the actual menstrual phase, right, where you have menses, right, or your period in air quotes here, not a scientific name, but what is normally used in colloquial conversations, that plus the proliferative phase basically correspond to the follicular phase, where you have major changes, especially with estrogen, right, and
Mhm.
FSH. Um, and then when we talk about the secretory phase, this is very much associated with the luteal phase, right? And we know the corpus luteum will secrete progesterone. Okay, so they fit pretty nicely in their little boxes. Again, it comes with thinking about how these two line up that it really becomes a true understanding versus just trying to shove it in your head. But again, I think with the uterine cycle, I think it almost helps to humanize the uterus as like just this organ that wants so desperately to have a baby. Whether the individual that owns the uterus wants a baby or not, that's what the uterus wants, right? And it's getting everything ready. It's building the little nursery. And if it doesn't get a baby at the end, it tears everything down, creates that very uncomfortable experience that many of us have with cramps and bloating and all of these things. It's all due to these cycling hormones. Um, and again, when those hormones drop, if the corpus luteum degrades, right? No more progesterone, the maintenance ability for progesterone goes away. No progesterone,
Yeah.
no maintenance. That's what triggers phase one, essentially, of the uterine cycle. And it's just a big circle. So I feel
Right.
like at this point, we've really demonstrated how the ovarian cycle, in many ways, calls the shots.
Right, right. And the uterine cycle is just kind of like, oh, now I've got progesterone. Oh, now I can do this now, right? It's kind of like just the outcome. Now I have got these things. But again, and I think when you understand that way, oh, it just, we don't want to memorize this, right? This is definitely a
Yeah,
process where it's like, oh, don't memorize like, oh, like, now it secretes. You're like, I want you to think, oh, it makes sense because I now have the progesterone. It makes sense why now I have this secretory phase of really building that lining.
yeah,
And I think understanding it in this way really helps when they ask us questions about it, right? Because the MCAT, again, it's most of the questions are not going to be, which hormone is really present in the luteal phase. Like that, you might have maybe one or two like that, but more of the questions are going to be along the lines of like, let's say this happened. What will be
hmm
the outcome? Like, let's say we tweaked to this thing. Let's say we didn't have an LH surge. What would happen? Let's
yeah,
say we maintain progesterone. We never actually had a drop. What would happen? Right? If we just memorize the cycle, we'll have no idea. We're like, oh, I didn't memorize what happens if things go wrong. No, but wait, we have to understand why these things happen because now we know, wait a minute, if I never have a drop in progesterone, oh, wait a minute, my lining wouldn't shed. It would just stay there kind of deal, right? Like these are the sorts of things, like the conclusions we'll be able to draw as long as we understand it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And those are impossible to memorize, by the way.
Mhm.
These are really the examples of how you're going to see this on your test. And this is why memorization isn't enough, right? If you just
Mhm.
memorize that LH surge causes ovulation, what would they do if they said a contraceptive maintains constant estrogen progesterone? It's like, I don't know. How does
I have
that
no
relate to
idea.
estrogen? Or how does that relate to ovulation? Like, the only information I have in my head was LH surge causes ovulation. If you don't know how that fits in the bigger picture, we're going to be totally lost, right? So
Mhm.
it's if, let's say, you always had stable estrogen and it never reached that critical concentration that created that switch from negative to positive feedback, you would never get that LH surge, which means you have no ovulation, which
Mhm.
makes sense. If you're talking about a contraceptive, you're trying to prevent fertilization, right? If you don't ovulate, you can't fertilize, right?
Mhm.
It's also why, like you said, a lot of oral contraceptives provide progesterone. They're literally progesterone pills. And that's why a lot of individuals who take those pills, they might lose their period. They might never get it, or maybe they don't get it for a period of time and then it comes back heavier. It's like the body responds to these in so many interesting ways, and you have to be ready to answer questions about this, either with information provided in a paragraph about an experiment or something like that, or even if it's shown graphically, right? There are so many really awesome ways that you could ask about this information in a passage. And you want to make sure you get lots of practice. Like,
Mhm.
you never not want to get practice. Like, you should always be doing questions and flashcards and things like this, but especially for hormones and especially with the menstrual cycle within the idea of endocrine system and reproduction. There are a lot of tricky questions.
Right. And I love the question, a lot of people ask me, it's like, oh, how is this X concept tested? Right. That I get that question all the time. And maybe this is just me. I really don't like that question. I really don't like it because the AMC is always getting extremely, extremely creative every single
Yes.
year. Like we just talked about with the AMC 6, where it's like you might see questions, you're like, I have never seen this type of question before. And so if we only ask ourselves, oh, wait, how is this asked? Right? We might not be prepared when they ask it in a totally new way. So
Yeah.
instead of like trying to always just try to anticipate, okay, what's the box of question that they might ask here? Understand the process so that however they ask it, we're prepared for it, right? That's how
I
I always like
almost,
to think.
yeah, I almost feel like that exact little blurb right there echoes conceptualization and understanding more than memorization. Like, I feel like asking, well, how is this going to be tested? If you're looking for like an objective list, like, oh, these are the three ways it's tested, like, what are you going to do with that? You're going to go memorize them.
Right.
Like, you need to be ready for whatever comes your way, right? And I think it comes down to, if you understand what's going on, if they tweak it in an unexpected way, you're going to recognize, do I have this knowledge in my head right now? No. But do I have the necessary tools in my toolkit? The passage reading skills, the critical thinking skills, and the basic content knowledge. Do I have the raw materials I need to put together a solid hypothesis? Right? I think it even is almost a shift from like a science student's mentality to like a real scientist mentality. Real
Hmm.
scientists create hypotheses and experiment based on what they already know, and they try and synthesize a new prediction and things like that. Like, that is what science is at its core, and that's what we do in the MCAT space, right?
Right, right.
So you're totally right. And they're so creative. And that's what keeps me here. That's what I'm saying. They're so creative with the way they ask questions. There's no one recipe of, if you prepare for these types of questions, you're done. That's why getting practice helps. You could see a couple different ways to ask it. Hopefully, if you see a brand new unfamiliar question, you'll have a couple experiences to draw from, but ultimately you're going to see stuff that you've never seen, and that's kind of the fun part if you choose
Mhm.
to see it that way.
If you choose to see it that way, it's very fun. If you don't, that can be very stressful. It's like, oh my goodness, you're telling me there's no prescribed way they're gonna ask me about this? Like, I'm sorry to break it to you. There isn't. They have
Oh,
told all they've given us is what can they test you on, which is the menstrual cycle. But they haven't told you how they're going to test it. So the best way to prepare for that is one, understand the cycle, and do a lot of practice. And if you're listening to this and you're like, where can I do practice from? Well, let's tell you about our a JW question bank. That's, hey, by the way, totally free. It's totally free. Link in like the description bio to check it out, where there's thousands of questions, and you can even select the specific question you want to be tested. If you want to be tested on the menstrual cycle, ovarian cycle, you can click on the button and say, hey, I want to be tested on hormones and the menstrual cycle. And you can get questions on it. Because if you're listening to this, like, okay, this is great, I need to test myself, check out the JW website. There should be a link in our bio for the Q Bank. Check it out. It's totally free. Can't recommend it enough.
Yeah. And in our textbook, which is also fully online and also fully for free, we do have embedded practice questions and flashcards and tutor tips and all those fun things. It's always fun to bring in free resources, right? They're amazing. They're on our website, jackwestin.com, if you want them. Among many other free resources, actually. That's like tip of the iceberg, but go check it out if you're curious. I think we've covered all the major points of menstruation and the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. What we haven't yet talked about is, what if progesterone doesn't drop? What if you actually do have fertilization? Like, what then, right? The whole cycles that we've been talking about that are just on repeat every single month, no question, no change. It's the same thing. What happens if you actually do have fertilization and implantation? Then what, right? How does the body use that little nest that the uterus has been making so diligently with hormonal inputs from the ovaries? How does it then support a growing embryo, right? Which becomes a fetus and now has to grow limbs and brains and organs and all this other stuff. Like, how does that work? That is what we're going to cover in our next episode.
Next episode. Yeah, I was like, oh, what? That's a great question. What happens there, Molly? That would be great to talk about in the next episode.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm super excited for this next one. And again, it's going to be, I think, the first episode we release in the new year, which is also going to be great. What better way to do the first episode of the new year than talking about, how, human beings begin, right? Like what I think that corresponds so well. So yeah, next episode we're going to be talking about fertilization, what happens in the body, and as well we're going to be talking about how we go from two gametes forming into a zygote to the different layers that form the brain, the spine, the skin, and and everything in between. So if you're excited, if you're interested in those things, come stay with us and check out our next episode. But until then, again, this is gonna be like released almost the day before the new year. So have a happy new year. We hope everyone enjoys the new year, stays safe, takes care of themselves. But please, please, please stay diligent in your studying. I know a lot of people right now have tests coming up very, very soon. So you've got this. Good luck. Until next time, happy studying.
Happy studying, everyone. Happy New Year. Bye.